March the 25th, 1996. The interviewee is Gunter Philipp. The interviewer, Barbara Meyerowitz. We are in Johannesburg, South Africa, and the language is English. The system is PAL. March the 25th, 1996. I'm Barbara Meyerowitz, interviewing Gunter Philipp. We're in Johannesburg, South Africa, and the language is English. Please say your name and spell it.
I'm Gunter Philipp, G-U-N-T-E-R, without an H. Philipp, P-H-I-L-I-P-P, note one L and two P's.
What is your birth date?
My birth date is the 23rd of January, 1913.
So how old are you now?
So I've just turned 83 a couple of months ago.
And where were you born, Gunter?
I was born in Berlin, Germany.
Please tell us a little bit about your family and how long they'd been established in Berlin for, and your family life in the early 20s.
Well, my family, if we start with my mother's side, her father came from a small place called Rosengarten, which is in East Prussia, and they came into Berlin, as far as I can remember, in about the middle of the 19th century. My grandfather started a factory with making household linens, and by dint of hard work, he managed to develop the business, which eventually was employing 300 people, and there was a big celebration when the firm could celebrate their 25th anniversary. Now, the business was one of the leading ones in Germany, and my grandfather, he took in his son-in-law as a partner, and after he passed away, he took in another son-in-law, and he died in 1927. I'm talking of my grandfather, and this was just before the Wall Street crash in 1928, when everything went which triggered off a world crisis. And as far as I remember, the business under my uncle's management did not survive for more than 3 years, longer than 3 years. Now, as far as my father's side is concerned, my grandfather was born in also a small place called Anklam, A-N-K-L-A-M, which is situated in Pomerania, which is a province near the Baltic Sea. And he also came to Berlin in the second half of the 19th century, and I remember that he had a factory making photo albums, and this factory was existed until his death in 1926. Now, my father rather to carry on with my grandfather on my father's side. He had married a widow with 2 sons, and had another 3 sons with her. Now, the younger son, the youngest son of the 3, never married because he was killed during the First World War. The other 2 married. They also went to served during the First World War, and they eventually they survived. Now, my father then went into business, and he actually started sort of an agency business in 1913, but after his service, when he returned from the war, he became a stockbroker, and he was very prosperous until 28, when he was also very badly hit by the Wall Street crash and the subsequent recession. Now, his brother, who survived, he had married a Belgian woman out of the faith, and they had 2 sons. Now, these 2 sons, strangely enough, although the mother wasn't Jewish, but they still, I think, had become bar mitzvahs, because in those days one wasn't too particular about it. And these 2 sons could opt eventually whether they wanted to remain German or whether they wanted to become Belgians. So they opted for Belgium, and they moved over to Brussels in I think it was 1929, and when war broke out, they both had to join the Belgian army. The one was taken prisoner and had to spend the war years in Germany, and the other one joined the French resistance. And after the war, they both returned, and I don't think what is happening afterwards is sort of relevant to what you would like to know. So would you mind just asking the next question?
Okay. Thinking of yourself as a young child and then as an adolescent growing up in Germany, describe your family life, and particularly whether you had any Jewish family life or memories of Jewish occasions.
Now, as far as my memory goes back, it does go back to the First World War, and there are quite a few things which I remember. We missed having a father around because he was in the army. I also still remember that there was a shortage of food. We had to eat what was called in German Stacheldraht, which means translated. The free translation is barbed wire, which was sort of a almost unedible mixture of turnips with something else in them. But eventually we managed to establish some connection, rather my parents did, to get some connection in the country, and we got sort of food parcels from the country, which made things a bit easier. Now, I do remember very distinctly what is called the revolution in 1918, when bullets were flying around, and there were the what is called Spartakists, in other words, the Spartacus army, which was completely left-wing, and they tried to overthrow the government. And of course, that is all history, but I still remember that the time very distinctly, and all the upheaval that follow. We were very lucky, really, I must say. My mother managed to take us on a seaside holiday every year, and well, the first trip abroad was at the end of 1923, when we went to Switzerland. But during that time already, we had what was in Germany a raging inflation, and I still remember vividly how we had to pay first thousands of marks for a loaf of bread, which eventually became 100,000 and millions and billions, and so my pocket money was eventually, say, 30 billion mark a week. And what can you buy with this? There was a shortage of most things. So when we got to Switzerland, and suddenly a franc was a franc, and we just couldn't believe it, actually. Well, by that time, you see, I had my first years of schooling behind me. I went to a school where they started, first preparatory school for the first 3 years, and after that I got what is really not quite the equivalent of high school, but which but it was at that time sort of like a high school. And the first 2 years I learned Latin, but then my mother decided, well, Latin was all very well, but it wouldn't get me very much further in life, and so she changed me over to what is called to a school in the Grunewald, where they started learning French during the time which I was learning Latin. So to keep up, I had to catch up with my French. And I still remember my mother, who was working with me, well, you can say every day and every evening, to enable me to catch up. But it did mean that I had a very good foundation eventually, and also I must say my Latin foundation was very useful in learning French. So eventually I was very good at school, and that helped me a great deal also with other languages, even with English. And now if I can refer to the school, now that school was sort of like, say, Yeovil High or King Edward in Johannesburg. It was 70-80% Jewish, and in other words, there was no anti-Semitism, and the school as such was extremely liberal, and so we had a very happy time there, right to the end. I matriculated in 1931. Now, if I can revert back a few years and talk about our family life, the family life as such was harmonious. We noticed there was a certain amount of frictions between my mother and my father, because my father liked playing cards and even mild gambling, not in a casino, but what they call a club, where he went every afternoon, and then I'm afraid I do remember clearly incurred my mother's displeasure. But otherwise, I would say that my childhood was very harmonious. I had a sister, Vera, which was born in 1915. So we were 2 years apart, which was very nice, because when we had what was in those days almost compulsory, we had dancing lessons. Well, of course, my sister and myself, we were together, and we were we had a nice crowd. We were going out together, and in those days there were what is called these 20th in Europe, of which you have heard, I think, and there were a few years where nobody really had, in our circle, had very many worries. I still remember that one particular occasion when I went to a dance. It was a press ball, as they called it, even by the press, and what we did then, you see, I took my sister. She was always sort of in my company, and not that I chaperoned her, but we got to a place where I said, "Look here, Vera, it's now 9 o'clock. I'll meet you again 2:30. And for the rest, we didn't see each other. And I remember the following day, my father came home, and he said, "You know, I met young Mr. So-and-so, and he said he had a most wonderful time last night, and he met a charming girl, and blah, blah, blah." Then he gave her name and says, "You know, it was my daughter." And so anyway, it was a very nice atmosphere, which persisted right up to 1933.
Tell us a little bit about your Jewish affiliation.
Well, I'm coming now to the Jewish affiliation. Now, we were brought up as Jews, but we were, well, I think the nearest comparison was we were sort of in between liberal and what in America they call conservative. Now, as far as Jewish learning is concerned, well, I had a smattering of learning in preparation for my bar mitzvah, which took place in 1926. Apart from that, the only holidays which were observed was Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. And I do remember every year we were at the Seder at my grandfather, and I very vividly remember ourselves and our young cousins cavorting around the table, and this is really quite vivid in my memory. Rosh Hashanah, we were invariably at my mother's parents' home. They had a beautiful home in the Grunewald with the whole family assembled. Apart from that, we did not really observe holidays like Purim, Shavuot, etc. And also we didn't observe Shabbat. Now, is there any other question you would like to know as far as that is concerned? Any other details?
Were your friends mainly Jewish?
Yes, our friends, I would say, were practically all Jewish. Now, if I talk about that, it might be of interest to mention that there were two very distinct Jewish communities in Berlin. The one which sort of came to Berlin, where the grandparents came to Berlin during the 19th century, early 19th century, and were settled and prosperous. Then we had and these Jews were relatively prosperous. Now, then we had another set of Jews which were living in a different part of Berlin, and which were Orthodox, more strictly Orthodox, I would say, and which I would say came more from Poland, Russia, particularly after the war, and after the Russian Revolution. Now, there was a very Orthodox established Jewish community already since the 19th century, who were living apart from the others in a different, probably more northern part of Berlin, and who received the refugees from Eastern Europe who came over after the war. But these Jews did not mix with the Jews on the other side of Berlin, of which we were part. And as a matter of fact, what was happening, which I didn't realize, of course, in those days, that the affluent Jewish community was only too anxious to get rid of them. And they did it by giving them money to enable them to emigrate to the United States or South Africa, Australia, or elsewhere. But they were not happy to mix with them or to have them. Now, why I'm sort of mentioning is because when I'm now sort of anticipating something which probably will come out later in the interview, when I arrived in Johannesburg, and of course there was a small established German community, but 90% of them were from Lithuania, Poland, Russia, etc., and quite a few of these were Jews who passed through Germany after the First World War, and and I must say, these people were more helpful than the German Jews who were here already for a long time, but they made us feel that they made us feel what happened to them after the war. They said to me, "Look, Gunter, now look here, we're very happy to have you here, we like you and everything, but please remember what happened to us, what your people did to us when we passed through Germany." So that really, was something which I wasn't even aware of to that extent. And I'm just mentioning it because I believe it belongs to the story.
I think it's a very interesting point. Do you think it emerged out of a kind of snobbery, a snobism? What was at the root of this antipathy between the two communities?
Really, as far as I can see. Now, the German Jews, of which we were part, they were very anticipated. How do you say? I'm just finding. Just give me the word.
Well organized.
Emancipated.
Emancipated.
That's the word I was looking for. They were emancipated, and they were integrated with the general German population. In other words, obviously, although, as I said, our social contact consisted mainly of Jews, there were many fields of activity where there was intermingling, like for instance, in business and arts, and for instance, the artists, they were all intermingling. There was not such a thing as a Jew or a Christian. They were painters or authors or whatever it was. So we were very much integrated into the German population, and the Eastern Jews. But I'm telling the truth now. With their pious and their long frocks and all that, to the German Jews. I'm not talking about myself personally, but to the majority of German Jews, they were, how can you say, they were sort of a source of embarrassment, and it is for that reason that they didn't like to be seen in their company. They didn't integrate with them. They didn't socialize, and they tried to get rid of them. I mean, it's really what happened. So I've got to be truthful about that. My
We should stop.
Religious. Can I stop now?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we just. In 1996, I'm Barbara Meyerowitz interviewing Gunter Philipp in Johannesburg, South Africa in English. This is tape 2. Gunter, we were talking about Berlin in the late 20s and early 30s, and I wonder if you can tell me what signs you began to see of Nazi activity, or possibly even of a new war building up.
Well, I would say that my first impression of Nazi activity came when I saw lorries packed with swastika, people with men with swastika around their arms, were racing down the Kurfürstendamm where we were staying, and well, it was quite a sort of unpleasant sight, and that gave me sort of the first practical inclination of what was going on. Now, I would say that, well, say physically, I didn't have very much experience to what was going to happen. On the other hand, I was a very avid newspaper reader, and we always had a collection of newspapers at home from a full spectrum of political activity. So I was able to follow the development during the 20th. And of course I was aware of the fact that the cause of this development was, I would say mainly economic. In other words, people did not sort of become Nazis or out of ideological reasons so much, but rather out of economic reasons, because they simply didn't have enough to eat, and there were millions of jobless, and which was of course one of the factors, I would not only factors, but I would say main factors which contributed to the rise of Nazism. And now, as I said, I was following the newspapers, and I could see what was going on. Now, my own political affiliation it was very neutral, really. When I turned 18, that was in 1931, I was allowed to vote, and I still remember my first walk to the voting booth, and I still remember that I cast my vote for the Social Democratic Party, which at that stage was one of the main parties in Germany. The others were actually far too much to the right for me even being interested. There was, of course, a very strong communist party, and what might be perhaps of interest was that my cousin Erich Cohn-Bendit, he was a very ardent communist, and in fact he got into some real trouble, and as far as I remember, he even had to leave Germany, and he went over to France. Now, this Erich later became the father of the notorious Erich Cohn-Bendit, who was leading the student revolt in Paris in 1968. My first real experience from Nazism came in 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, and I still remember we had to go by car to the center of town, and the car was just about swamped by the Nazi hordes, which were celebrating their victory. And I remember very clearly the scene at the Brandenburg gate when they nearly capsized our car. But not because we were Jewish, but just because they were all so happy that they came to power. I must say that in those days, at the beginning, none of us was really too worried, because even the Jewish community wasn't too worried. There were only very few who were really able to foresee what was going to happen. The general opinion was, Hitler, fine, let him come to power. After a year or two, he'll be gone. and we'll get back to normal. Well, that was the general attitude, and that's why sort of everybody was fairly relaxed. But of course, this attitude didn't last too long. Now, to revert back to myself, after I matriculated in 1931, the question arose: what shall become of me? What sort of profession should I follow? I must say, quite honestly, there was nothing really I was particularly interested in, and my mother sort of made several suggestions. Do you want to become a journalist? I said, no, I don't think I've got the make of a journalist. Do you want to become a lawyer? I said, I'm not sure. Do you want to go into the hotel business? I said, well, look, I can't really tell you. So eventually, he says, look here, why not getting a general commercial education, and afterwards you can decide for yourself what you want to do. So I said, well, that's fine. So now, then I entered into a contract of apprenticeship, as it was in those days in Germany, with a leading firm of exporters, and there was a proper apprenticeship contract for 3 years, from middle of 1931 till I think end of 1934 or middle of 34. So that was settled then, and my mother said, now look here, we'll make the contract on the 1st of September, you've got about 6 months. How about learning a foreign language? You speak a bit of English, you speak French. Would you like to go to university in France? Well, that suited me very well. I was very pleased about it. So my mother went down with me to Toulouse. I remember it was in the south of France. But there, we didn't like the atmosphere, and so we went on to Grenoble, which was situated at the foot of the French Alps, and beautiful place and very nice. So I stayed there and took a course in French language and literature at the university. And it was a very happy time of my life. We made a lot of acquaintances, a lot of friends from all parts of the world. And I must say the friends I made there, they included Arabs, they included Iranians, they included Romanians, Yugoslavs, Americans. We were an extremely happy crowd, and I was very sorry when the term ended, and after having sort of traveled around a bit in France and Belgium, looked up the family, etc., to my great chagrin, I had to go back to Berlin and start the apprenticeship, the idea of which I was never very keen on, really, but it was the best I could think of in those days. Anyway, the experience didn't turn out all that bad, because I really learned something. Looking back to those years, there's one thing. I must say, my mother, she neglected nothing. She got me the best education possible. No money was spared. But where I feel now, with the benefit of hindsight, was during the time of my apprenticeship, I didn't go to night school to learn bookkeeping and general knowledge, although I bought quite a few books. But I'm mentioning this because the lack of proper, say, knowledge in bookkeeping eventually proved a handicap when I came to South Africa. Now, during my apprenticeship, my knowledge in French and English meant that apart from my normal duties as an apprentice, which was licking stamps and staying over after everybody else went home, collecting the keys from the bosses at 7 o'clock in the morning, otherwise being the first at the office and being the last to leave, because I had to take the keys back again, which meant a 14 hours day, and including 6 hours on Saturday morning. So meant that I sort of got quite a sort of all-round experience as far as business was concerned, and also, of course, I saw the correspondence from abroad, and I realized that people were, our business partners, friends, were worried about what was happening in Germany. And of course, the overseas press was painting a pretty black pictures of things, because in those days the Nazis started already to sort of go against the Jews, to go against anything or suppress anything which was liberal in politics and in art, literature, whatever it was. We had that night when the books were burnt.
Do you remember that?
I remember that very clearly.
Do you? Did you go to see it? Or?
I didn't go to see it, but I saw, of course, the report and the pictures and everything. And people overseas, our friends, wanted to know, look here, what is going on? And of course, the German government was worried about it. And they circularized all the export houses and said, look here, you write to your friends that this is all atrocity propaganda. It's all exaggerated. It's all not true. Everything is perfectly normal. So our bosses had to draft letters to their clients abroad, and I had to translate most of these letters. But of course, eventually we couldn't get away from the fact that the whole that everything in Germany became Nazified. In other words, they were already. It started right at the schools. Now, I don't know whether Barbara, whether that's of interest to whether I should talk about it. See, what was happening is now that Jewish children were frozen out of government schools. They were made to feel they should not. They had to. There was put pressure on them to leave. Now, so you got more. These schools got more and more letters from parents, and these letters said, "We are sorry, we have to remove our children from your school for reasons which you would appreciate, etc., etc." And a lot of these youngsters joined Jewish organizations and emigrated to Palestine. Others went to Jewish day schools, but they were all frozen out of these schools, government schools, during the 1933 and 1934. The same applied to our teachers, those whose views were considered too liberal were forced into early retirement, and particularly that applied particularly to the headmasters, and the headmasters were replaced by party stalwarts who Nazified all the schools, and that was a process which was already begun early during the Nazi period, 1933, 1934, 1935. Also, in those days, my parents felt the economic squeeze, and we had to cut down on our standard of living. I remember that our beautiful flat on the Kurfürstendamm had to be auctioned off, and we had to giving it up, and that was at the time when I left Germany. Now, it's not that I was actually leaving as a refugee at the time, because the idea had always been that once I finished my apprenticeship with my export firm, I would go overseas to get some more international experience. But the firm I was working for, there were already signs of Nazification. In other words, staff members appear with the Nazi emblems, armband. There were Nazi cells in the firm, and the members of which were people who we would never even have suspected of being Nazis, and which came as a tremendous shock. Now, they were Nazis, but in those cases, they were not Jew haters or anything. On the contrary, we were still as friendly as we were before, but they were Nazis, and obviously, whether they wanted it or not, they had to withdraw from the Jewish entanglement. And obviously, all the Jewish firms eventually became Nazified too. But so
your firm was a Jewish firm.
The firm was a Jewish firm, but fortunately for them, they had branches in Paris, New York, and London, so they could close these German branches eventually. Now, so in other words, it was eventually decided that instead of sort of finishing my apprenticeship, I would cut it short. So instead of having my full 3 years, I had just over 2 years. And but you know, every contract has got an end, and you are qualified. And of course, my bosses, under the circumstances, decided, they said, look, you are qualified. Now we give you a certificate of qualification, although you didn't really finish your term. And that is very similar to what happened during the war, when youngsters who went to school didn't finish their matric, but they were granted what is called an emergency matric. In other words, they were matriculants, but they didn't really finish schools altogether, because they had to go into the army.
But it is interesting that you decided to leave at that minute. And
Well,
there was some kind of urgency about going.
Well, the urgency was really the Nazification of my firm, which made it impracticable to stay with them. But eventually I would have had to leave some, and so the head of the firm, they decided, well, whoever wanted to leave could leave, and they gave me a full certificate of qualification. That was a qualified, whatever you call it. There's no really equivalent for it in South Africa, but I had a full apprenticeship. Now, my mother, and I'm talking about my mother because my father didn't take too much interest in our education. We had connections in America, and so she said, look, go to America. I think it's a nice place. I could have gone there also with the recommendation of my firm, and I don't think there would have been a great deal of difficulty. But then my mother came home one day and said, you know, Gunter, I was in the chocolate shop of Mrs. Conn. Over Mrs. Conn, with whom I'm very friendly, and we were talking, and she showed me letters from her son, who a year or two ago went to South Africa, and he wrote and he absolutely loves this country, and I'd like you to Mrs. Conn gave me his letters, and I'd like you to look at them. So I looked at the letters, and they were from a certain Walter Conn, and I don't think you know him. And he went to South Africa to work for a firm in Benoni. It's a firm, Hillman Brothers, if you ever heard of them. And these letters, really, they were. He was very enthusiastic about it, about conditions, the climate, etc. So my mother said, look here, from what I can see, South Africa seems to be a nicer place than in the United States. So but why not? So I said, okay, let's go to South Africa. If I don't like it, I can always go back to elsewhere. So that is what made me come to South Africa.
Was there no discussion ever of staying on in Germany and finding another place to work or something else to do? Were you convinced that you must leave?
Now, in those days, actually, there was still the impression that things might be straightened out. But in the meantime, being a young man of 20 years, I didn't worry about that. In other words, the idea was to go to South Africa, see what was going on, and stay there for a while, and then make a decision. Now, did I mention already about my father?
No.
My father, as I said, was a stockbroker, and also the stock exchange was Nazified. In other words, stockbrokers could no longer remain, and excuse me, let's take a sip of water. And my father also was under threat of notice, but being a veteran, he was allowed to stay on for a while. And I think I mentioned that this didn't turn out too well because eventually he had to leave. And so I went, and my parents stayed behind because even in those days, my father was not qualified to go anywhere, and things still didn't look too bad, and so he decided they stayed on.
And what happened to your sister?
My sister, she had also, she took a course, a secretarial course, and then went to Scotland for a year, and then she joined me in South Africa in 1935.
She also decided not to
no, she couldn't go. She wouldn't go
back to Germany.
Yes. Now, where would you like me to continue?
This is March the 25th, 1996. I'm Barbara Meyerowitz, interviewing Gunter Philipp. We're in Johannesburg, South Africa. The interview is in English, and this is tape 3. Gunter, you were telling the story about your parents.
Now, actually, I didn't see my parents again for a number of years, except for my mother, who came to South Africa in 1935, which was really more on a holiday to see what was going on, and she went back again a couple of months later. Now, my parents moved to a flat in a villa in the Grunewald, very nice, beautiful actually. They had enough to live on, but they were not as wealthy as they had been on account of the recession, and also actually the problem started in 1928-29 when the New York Stock Exchange crash came, and which of course also affected everybody, including my father. Now, my father, of course, did not work after he was expelled from the exchange, and they lived a very quiet life, actually. As far as they didn't have any real experiences. So they couldn't really tell me what was going on, and in any case they wouldn't have done that, because even in those days the correspondence was censored, and you had to be a bit careful what you were saying. So all that was so. But of course, I could. I was aware of what was going on through the newspapers here in South Africa, which of course was quite a big worry, and of course, on the other hand, we ourselves were busy trying to establish ourselves here, so we didn't have too much time to worry, because we had to worry about ourselves too. Until one day in 1900 and late until 1938, when we received the news, which was a bombshell, that my father was arrested on a pretext and sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. Now, even in those days, we knew what was going on there, and we didn't really know what was going on, except that we knew that my mother was trying to do everything possible to get him released and to mobilize all the connections, and eventually, it was a period where a lot of Jews were arrested as sort of retribution to, I think it was at the time when this fellow Rat shot this counselor at the French embassy in Paris. And if you remember that, perhaps. So anyway, in those days, even South Africa had barred the immigration of Jews from Germany. That was in 1936, except for parents where one party was 59 or 58 years old. My father was 55, so he didn't qualify. Now, my sister's first husband, he managed through some connection to get a permit for Swaziland, and so once he had the permit, my father, they released my father from the concentration camp, and they were able to get a boat to Lorenzo Marx, actually also a German boat, and but of course to get to Swaziland at the time they had to come through Johannesburg, and there was no problem getting a visitor's permit, because once we could produce the Swaziland permit, there was no problem getting the visitor's permit to South Africa, and that they could stay here for a few months.
Did your father ever tell you what had happened in Buchenwald and how he was treated there?
No. He never mentioned it, and he never asked. And seeing that you asked that question, I want to say that we have got friends who were survivors of Auschwitz, and they never once mentioned a word of their experiences. And I do know also for a fact that they were also interviewed either by you or by Kim, and I'm sure they must have opened up their hearts and told about their experiences. But we didn't ask questions, and they never volunteered any experience.
Did he look different? Did he look as if he'd been through some sort of physical trauma?
Yes, my father.
Yes.
Yes, he looked 20 years older, and he was a broken man.
He was a broken man.
And of course, he wasn't able to do any work or anything, and we actually, my sister and I, we had to support them during the time we were in Swaziland, because they were not able to take out anything except certain personal belongings, which went to Lorenzo Marx and eventually which came up to Johannesburg.
Had he ever managed to take any money out of Germany before then?
Well, I got £100 when I left to South Africa. And my sister also didn't take much more.
100 marks or 100 pounds?
100 pounds.
100 pounds.
I don't know how much that was in marks.
Yeah.
So you can imagine.
So you left everything you'd ever worked for or owned in Germany?
Well,
your parents did?
My parents did, yes.
They were divested of everything?
They left everything behind. And, well,